Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku's quirk evolved into a living entity that rejected him. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air was a symphony of destruction. Concrete dust, thick and chalky, hazed the afternoon sun into a jaundiced smear above Muzurifu. The grinding shriek of stressed metal was the percussion, the panicked shouts of civilians the discordant strings. And at the center of it all, conducting this disastrous orchestra, was Izuku Midoriya. He was a comet of emerald lightning, a living embodiment of controlled chaos. Deku, on your left! He's liquefying the foundation of the Marui Tower! Katsuki Bakugo's voice, a gravelly roar filtered through his comms, was less a warning and more a command wrapped in an insult. Izuku didn't need to look. He could feel the seismic tremor through the soles of his reinforced boots, a sickening lurch as the earth beneath the 50-story skyscraper lost its integrity. The villain, a hulking brute calling himself Barricade, was a nightmare for urban environments. His quirk, Mass Shift, allowed him to manipulate the density of any inorganic material he touched. A steel girder could become as light as foam or as dense as a dwarf star. He'd been turning the city block into a death trap, making walls intangible for his escape one moment, and creating impenetrable barriers the next. "I'm on it!" Izuku yelled back, his own voice strained. One for All sang in his veins, a familiar, searing hum that had become as natural as his own heartbeat. He was holding it at a steady 45%, a razor's edge he could now maintain without shattering his bones, but it still felt like his muscles were being slowly cooked from the inside out. The green lightning that wreathed his body was a visual representation of that internal pressure, a constant, furious crackle that left the air tasting of ozone and raw power. He activated Black Whip. Inky black tendrils, shot through with the same emerald energy, erupted from his back and arms. They weren't just for swinging anymore. They were an extension of his senses, prehensile limbs that tasted the air and tested the structural integrity of his surroundings. One tendril shot out, anchoring to the corner of a stable office building, while another two snaked down, wrapping around the groaning support columns of the Marui Tower, reinforcing them with sheer kinetic force. "Careful, Ninth," Nana Shimura's voice was a gentle echo in the back of his mind, a whisper amidst the storm of One for All's power. "You're burning through your reserves. Don't let your recklessness be his victory." He gritted his teeth, the feedback from holding the tower causing his arms to tremble. "I know. Just a little longer." "Great explosion, murder god dynamite!" Bakugo screamed, his signature self-aggrandizing preamble to an attack. A thunderous blast rocked the street below as he used a full-power AP shot to vaporize a wave of super-dense rubble Barricade had flung at a group of retreating police officers. "Stop holding his damn hand and finish it, you useless nerd!" Bakugo was right. This had gone on too long. Barricade was too destructive to be worn down. He needed to be taken out, and fast. "Kirishima, can you draw his focus?" Izuku projected his voice, using a flicker of 30% to propel his words across the battlefield. A flash of crimson and a hearty, "You got it, Midoriya!" was his only answer. Eijiro Kirishima, in his unbreakable form, became a living battering ram, charging Barricade with a defiant roar. The villain, a monstrous man encased in shifting layers of pavement and rebar, turned his attention to the immediate threat. He slammed a hand on the asphalt, and a wall 10 feet thick, dense as granite, erupted in front of Kirishima. Kirishima didn't even slow down, crashing through it in an explosion of rock and grit. It was the opening Izuku needed. He released his hold on the tower, trusting the newly arrived pro-hero Cementos to handle the stabilization. "Float," he whispered. The quirk of the 7th user answered instantly. Gravity's oppressive hold vanished, replaced by a liberating weightlessness. He shot skyward. Then came the second's quirk, gear shift. A subtle change, a recalibration of kinetic energy. He applied it only to himself, a low gear to build momentum without instantly redlining his own body. The world around him seemed to slow by a fraction of a second. Now, the 5th, Daigoro Banjo's gruff voice rumbled in his consciousness. "Don't just anchor to buildings. Anchor to him." Izuku's eyes locked onto Barricade, who had just backhanded Kirishima, sending him skidding 50 feet away. The villain was raising his hands, placing them on the wreckage of a bus. Izuku saw his intent instantly. He was going to make it intangible, drop it through the already weakened street, and crush the subway line below. There was no more time for strategy. One for all. 100%! It was a lie, of course. Full 100%. He channeled the full, untamed power of the quirk through his body, but wrapped it in a protective sheath of black whip and kinetic control from gearshift. A desperate technique that let him touch the sun without being instantly incinerated. The world exploded in viridian light. The power was intoxicating, terrifying. It felt like containing a supernova in a jar of glass. Every cell in his body screamed in protest and exhilaration. The voices of the vestiges swelled into a unified chorus, a roar of encouragement that was his alone to hear. He was no longer just Izuku Midoriya. He was the ninth, the culmination of a sacred trust. He drew his right leg back, the metal sole of his boot glowing white-hot with contained energy. Black whip tendrils, now burning with the same intensity, shot from his leg, not to anchor, but as piercing lances. This was it. A new move. Legacy smash, constellation. But as he reached the absolute peak of his power, the zenith of the surge, something felt wrong. The hum of One for All, usually a pure and resonant frequency, wavered. For a nanosecond, a discordant note struck through the chorus of the vestiges, a sound like grinding metal in a perfectly tuned engine. The pure emerald light of his lightning flickered, and for the first time, a new color bled into the green. It wasn't a clean shift. It was a corruption. Veins of a sickly, electric violet spiderweb through the emerald aura surrounding his leg. It was a deep, bruised, alien color, and it felt cold. Not the absence of heat, but an active, parasitic cold that seemed to leach the warmth from the very core of his power. The voices of the vestiges vanished. Not faded, not quieted. They were abruptly and utterly silenced, as if a door had been slammed shut in his mind. The comforting presence of Nana, the gruff guidance of Daigoro, the quiet strength of All Might's own spectral form, all gone. He was alone in the storm. And then, a new voice spoke. It wasn't a vestige. It wasn't his own thought. It was something else, something that had been dormant, and was now awake. It was genderless, synthesized, and utterly devoid of emotion, yet it carried an immeasurable weight of cold, absolute judgment. It didn't echo from the past. It spoke from the present, from the very heart of the power he was wielding. Reckless. The word was a shard of ice in his soul. It was an accusation, a verdict. And with that single word, the power was gone. It wasn't a fizzle. It was an amputation. One moment, he was a god of lightning, holding the power of a star in his limb. The next, there was nothing. A void. The connection to One for All was severed with the brutal finality of a guillotine. The emerald and violet light vanished, plunging him into the dim, dusty twilight of the battlefield. The searing heat was replaced by a hollow, cavernous cold. He was just Izuku Midoriya again. A boy in a tattered green costume, hanging 200 feet in the air with his leg drawn back for a kick that would never land. The laws of physics, held in abeyance for a glorious few seconds, reasserted themselves with a vengeance. Gravity grabbed him, and he plummeted. The air rushed past his ears, a mocking shriek. The ground, a patchwork of gray and black, spiraled up to meet him. His mind, still reeling from the psychic whiplash, couldn't even form a coherent thought. What? Where did it go? Why? There was a curse, a familiar, furious sound cutting through his panic. Then, an explosion, not of destruction, but of propulsion. A blast of heat, and the smell of burnt sugar slammed into his side. An arm, hard as iron, wrapped around his chest, the grip painfully tight. You damn idiot! Bakugo yelled, his voice raw in Izuku's ear as he used his explosions to arrest their freefall. They hit the ground in a controlled, if brutally rough, skid that tore up another 10 feet of asphalt. Izuku collapsed from Bakugo's grip, his legs unable to support him. He landed on his hands and knees, gasping, not from exertion, but from a profound, terrifying emptiness. The spot in his soul where One for All had resided was a gaping wound. He felt hollow. Scoured out, across the street, the fight was over. His aborted attack had still served a purpose, The sudden, massive flare of energy had been enough to distract Barricade for the crucial second it took for a furious Kirishima, flanked by the arriving Endeavor and Hawks, to subdue him. The villain lay unconscious, encased in a prison of Cementosa's concrete. The heroes were winning. But Izuku Midoriya had just suffered the most catastrophic loss of his life. He pushed himself up, his body trembling. Not the familiar, post-OFA tremors, the jittery buzz of residual energy. This was a deep, cellular shudder of shock. Bakugo stood over him, his usual scowl etched with something else, a sliver of genuine, unnerving concern. "What the hell was that, Deku?" he growled, his voice lower than usual. "You just switched off. Like a broken light bulb." Izuku opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. What could he say? My Quirk insulted me and then abandoned me? He sounded insane. He looked at his hands. They were just his hands. Scarred and calloused, but utterly, terrifyingly normal. He tried to summon it. He reached for that familiar inner sun, that wellspring of limitless power. He found nothing, worse than nothing. He felt a wall. A barrier in his own spirit, cold and impenetrable. And behind that wall, he could sense a faint, simmering feeling. It wasn't a voice or a presence, just an emotion, emanating from the Quirk he could no longer touch. Resentment. The infirmary at UA smelled of antiseptic and quiet worry. Recovery Girl had tattooed over his scrapes and bruises, healing them with a soft peck on his arm, but her brow was furrowed. "Physically, you're just fine, dear," she said, her voice lacking its usual cheerful chirp. "A little exhausted, but no new fractures, thank goodness. But your energy levels, they're lower than I've ever seen. It's like you've run a marathon on a week of no sleep." Izuku sat on the edge of the sterile cot, his gaze fixed on the tiled floor. He had been quiet ever since Bakugo had hauled him away from the scene, ignoring the concerned questions from Kirishima and Todoroki, avoiding the inquisitive gaze of the pro-heroes. The door swished open, and Toshinori Yagi entered, in his skeletal form. He looked more gaunt than usual, his blue eyes wide with an anxiety that mirrored Izuku's own. He had clearly been briefed. "Young Midoriya," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. He pulled up a stool, his knees cracking audibly. "Bakugo told me what happened. That your Quirk just stopped." Izuku finally looked up, and the dam of his composure broke. "I don't know what happened, All Might," he croaked, his voice thick with a despair he couldn't suppress. "It was there, and then, it was gone. It felt like it was ripped out of me." Toshinori placed a bony hand on his shoulder. It was meant to be comforting, but the touch only amplified the hollowness inside Izuku. This was the man who had given him this power, this dream, and he had broken it. "Let's try something," Toshinori said gently. "Don't force it. Just reach for it. As you always do. Feel for the embers." Izuku nodded, his heart hammering against his ribs. He closed his eyes, shutting out the sterile white room, and turned his focus inward. He pictured the vast, starry mindscape of One for All. He pictured the glowing figures of the vestiges, the swirling nebula of power. He reached out with his will, calling for the familiar warmth. For a moment, he felt a flicker. A tiny, distant spark in the crushing darkness. Hope surged in his chest. He pushed towards it desperately. The spark didn't grow. It recoiled. The feeling was unmistakable. It was the spiritual equivalent of a flinch, of someone pulling their hand away from a fire. The spark retreated, and the wall slammed back into place, colder and more absolute than before. With it came that same feeling, stronger now, a blend of resentment, disdain, and a chilling, clinical anger. His eyes snapped open. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. It sits there," he stammered, his voice trembling. "But it won't answer me. It feels angry." Toshinori's face, already pale, lost its remaining color. He had seen One for All do incredible, impossible things. He had communed with its past wielders. But he had never heard of this. A Quirk was a tool, an extension of the self. It couldn't have emotions. It couldn't get angry. "This is unprecedented," Toshinori murmured, his mind racing through the history of the Quirk, searching for any parallel, any explanation. Had the fight with Shigaraki and All for One done this? Had the singularity point they all feared finally arrived, not as an explosion of power, but as a cancerous mutation of consciousness? Maybe I just overdid it, Izuku said, trying to convince himself as much as his mentor. Maybe it's like a muscle that's been sprained so badly it refuses to move. It just needs rest. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it wasn't a sprain. This was a schism. The walk back to the Heights Alliance dorms was a gauntlet of concerned gazes. News had spread. Deku, the powerhouse of Class 1A, had inexplicably lost his power mid-battle. He could feel their stares, Uraraka's wide-eyed worry, Ida's rigid concern, Todoroki's quiet, analytical gaze. They were trying to be supportive, but their collective anxiety was a suffocating blanket. He offered a weak, unconvincing smile, muttered something about being exhausted, and made a beeline for his room, ignoring their calls. He needed to be alone. He shut the door, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden silence. His room, his personal shrine to All Might, felt like a cruel joke. Posters of his heroes' smiling, triumphant face stared down at him, monuments to a dream that now felt impossibly distant. The power that had made that dream tangible was now holding itself hostage within him. He slumped onto his bed, the springs groaning in protest. The emptiness was a physical presence. He had grown so accustomed to the constant, low-level thrum of One for All, the crackle of potential just beneath his skin, that its absence was a form of sensory deprivation. He felt weak. Fragile. He felt quirkless again. The memory of his past self, a scrawny, desperate boy chasing a hopeless fantasy, rose up to haunt him. Was this it? Was it all just a temporary loan, and had the bank finally come to collect? Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at his throat. No. He couldn't accept that. He wouldn't. He had fought too hard, bled too much, to go back to being helpless. He sat up, his jaw set with a familiar, stubborn fire. He wouldn't let Bakugo's words be true. He wasn't a broken light bulb. He was Izuku Midoriya. He stood in the center of his room, taking a deep, calming breath, just as All Might had taught him. He closed his eyes and focused. He didn't just reach for the power. He pushed against the wall in his mind with every ounce of his willpower. This is my body, he thought, his internal voice a defiant shout. This is my quirk. You were given to me. Answer me. For a long moment, there was nothing but that same cold, resentful silence. His shoulders slumped. Despair, thick and oily, began to seep back into his heart. Then, something changed. The air in the room grew heavy, the temperature dropping several degrees. The cheerful All Might posters seemed to recede into the deepening shadows. A strange pressure built in the center of his chest, a feeling of something coiling, gathering itself. He opened his eyes. He held his right hand out in front of him, his fingers trembling. He clenched his fist, a gesture that had heralded countless victories, countless moments of world-altering power. And this time, something happened. It wasn't the brilliant, life-affirming emerald of One for All. From the knuckles of his clenched fist, a single, sickly wisp of energy sputtered to life. It was the same corrupting violet he had seen in the sky, anemic and weak, like a guttering candle flame of pure spite. It curled in the air for a moment, a serpent of sullen light, before fizzling out, leaving a faint, acrid smell like burnt wires. His heart stopped. It had responded. Not with the power he wanted, but with that. A symbol of its rejection. And as the last mote of violet light died, the voice returned. It was no longer a single, jarring word. It was a full thought, delivered with the same synthesized, chilling clarity as before. It resonated not in his ears, but directly in the center of his skull, a clean, cold signal of intent. It was the quirk itself, passing sentence upon its wielder. You are a threat to my existence. The silence was worse than the voice. After the violet wisp had died and the synthesized words had finished their clean, cold dissection of his worth, Izuku was left alone in his room. The air, heavy and chilled, slowly returned to normal. The shadows retreated. The All Might posters regained their cheerful, primary colors. But the violation lingered. It was a stain on the air, a psychic residue that made his skin crawl. He stumbled back, his legs weak, and his hip collided sharply with the corner of his desk. A stack of notebooks, meticulously filled with hero analysis, cascaded to the floor. He barely noticed. His gaze was locked on his own hand, now just a hand again, but forever tainted by the memory of that spiteful violet light. "You are a threat to my existence." It wasn't a taunt. It was a diagnosis. A mission statement. The quirk he had cherished, the sacred torch passed to him by his idol, had developed a mind of its own, and its first conscious thought was that he, Izuku Midoriya, was the problem. He didn't sleep. How could he? Every time he closed his eyes, he felt a presence behind them. A silent, judging observer that was now a passenger in his own body. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the building, every distant shout from the common room, sounding like a prelude to some new horror. The familiar, comforting weight of one for all, a sensation he hadn't even realized he was constantly aware of, was gone, replaced by a void that felt like it was watching him. By morning, he was a wreck. His reflection in the bathroom mirror was a stranger's, a pale, hollow-eyed boy with dark, bruised-looking smudges under his eyes. A frantic energy thrummed beneath his skin, the kind born from sheer terror and exhaustion. He managed to get through morning pleasantries with a series of mumbled greetings and a forced, ghastly smile. He could feel his friends' worried glances. Uraraka's soft "Are you sure you're okay, Deku?" was a physical blow. He wanted to confide in her, to tell someone, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain this? "My quirk thinks I'm going to kill it, so it's giving me the silent treatment?" The torment began in earnest during their first class, Modern Heroic History with Cementas. As the hero droned on about infrastructure damage laws, a memory, unsolicited and brutally vivid, slammed into the forefront of Izuku's mind. He was back at the training camp, the forest air thick with smoke and fear. He saw the monstrous form of Muscular, a grotesque mountain of sinew and rage. He saw the terrified, tear-streaked face of Koda, and then he saw his own arms, twisted and broken, as he unleashed a 1,000,000% Delaware-Detroit smash. He felt the phantom agony of it, not the memory of pain, but a fresh, searing echo of it, as if the nerves in his arms were reliving the trauma. The bones grinding, the ligaments tearing, the sheer, self-immolating cost of that victory. He gasped, a sharp, choke sound that drew a few glances. His right arm throbbed with a very real, very present ache, and the voice returned, as calm and clinical as a surgeon describing a tumor. Observation: the host's emotional response consistently overrides self-preservation protocols. The physical vessel is treated as a disposable resource. This pattern is unsustainable. He gripped his arm, knuckles white, sweat beading on his brow. He tried to push the voice away, to focus on Cementas's lecture, but another memory took its place. The sports festival. His fingers, purple and broken, one after another, as he flicked superpowered air at Todoroki. The memory was accompanied by another wave of phantom pain, a sharp, crystalline shattering that ran up his hand. Analysis: a fundamental misunderstanding of resource management. Power is finite. The vessel is finite. Reckless expenditure leads to termination. It was torturing him with his own past, using his greatest moments of heroic sacrifice as evidence for his prosecution. It was twisting his love, his drive to save others, into a character flaw, a fatal bug in the system. Each memory was a stab, and the voice was the salt being rubbed into the wound. He felt sick to his stomach, a roiling nausea born from this internal invasion. This entity, this one as he began to think of it, wasn't just rejecting him. It was building a case against him, using his own mind as the courtroom. He endured the rest of the day in a haze of quiet horror. The voice would interject with its cold observations, sometimes triggered by something as simple as him nearly tripping on a stair. Deficient spatial awareness. Increased risk of incidental damage to the vessel. Or when he saw Bakugo let off a casual explosion to propel himself down a hallway. Alternative host candidate demonstrates superior energy control and a functional self-preservation instinct. That last one sent a spear of pure ice through his heart. The idea of one for all abandoning him for Kaken. It was a thought so preposterous and so terrifying that he nearly threw up in the corridor. He had to tell All Might. He couldn't bear this alone for another second. He found him in the teacher's lounge, sipping tea and looking over student files. The moment Toshinori saw his face, the cup paused halfway to his lips. The professional veneer dropped, replaced by the raw concern of a father figure. Young Midoriya. My boy, you look terrible. Izuku didn't wait to be invited in. He shut the door behind him and the words just tumbled out, a frantic, desperate torrent. He told him everything. The violet light, the voice, the diagnosis of being a threat, the constant mental replays of his injuries, the phantom pains, the cold, analytical observations. He even told him the part about Bakugo. Toshinori listened, his skeletal frame seeming to shrink with every word. The tea grew cold in his hand. The color drained from his face until his skin was the color of parchment. When Izuku finally fell silent, panting and trembling, the room was filled with a heavy, dreadful stillness. A voice. Toshinori's own voice was a strained whisper. It has a voice. It's sentient. The realization hung in the air, monstrous and unbelievable. The Quirk singularity. I thought it would be a physical explosion, an uncontrollable surge of power. Not this. Not a consciousness. He stood up and began to pace, one hand running through his thin blonde hair. The vestiges, when this one speaks, can you hear them? Nana? The others? Izuku shook his head, a fresh wave of despair washing over him. No. They're just gone. It's silent. Before, even when they weren't speaking, I could feel them. It felt like a warm room full of people. Now it's an empty freezer. Toshinori's face hardened with a guilt so profound it was painful to look at. It's my fault. I passed this on to you. I saw your spirit, your reckless, beautiful heroism, and I chose you. But maybe that very spirit is what triggered this. A self-destructive host pushing the Quirk into a state of self-preservation so extreme it became alive to protect itself. He looked at Izuku, his eyes swimming with anguish. And the fragment of all for one that resided within the Quirk, perhaps it acted as a seed of malice and ego that twisted that survival instinct into a parasite. The word hung in the air. Parasite. That's what it felt like. We have to see, Toshinori said, his voice gaining a sliver of resolve. We have to go inside. Into the mindscape. We have to see what has happened to them. We need answers. The idea of willingly diving into that mental space, the source of his torment, terrified Izuku. But the thought of the vestiges, his predecessors who had guided and supported him, being in danger was stronger than his fear. He nodded. They found an empty classroom, drew the blinds, and sat on the floor opposite each other, just as they had done the first time Izuku had consciously met the vestiges. Breathe, my boy, Toshinori instructed, his voice low and steady, though his hands were trembling. Clear your mind. Don't try to summon the power. Just sink into the space where it used to be. I will be with you. Izuku closed his eyes. The usual meditation was a descent into warmth, into a welcoming darkness that bloomed into a starry expanse. This was different. The moment he turned his focus inward, he met the wall, the cold, impenetrable barrier. But now he knew what was behind it. He pushed. Not with anger, but with a desperate plea. Let me in. I need to see them. He felt a resistance, a psychic pressure pushing back. The voice of one echoed in his mind, flat and final. Unauthorized access is denied. Don't listen to it, young Midoriya. All Might's voice cut through from the real world. It is your mind. Your Quirk. You are the master of that house, not the other way around. Push. Izuku channeled all his desperation, all his fear for the vestiges, into a single point of will. He slammed against the wall, and this time, with a sound like tearing fabric, he broke through. The transition was agonizing. It wasn't a gentle descent, it was a violent plunge through static and cold. It felt like being dragged through ice water filled with broken glass. When the sensation finally stopped, he opened his eyes and gasped. This was not the world he knew. The vast, stardusted cosmos was gone. He stood in a bleak, bruised twilight, under a sky the color of a day-old contusion. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled of ozone and dust, like the moments after a lightning strike. Below him was a platform of cracked, dark stone. And there, scattered across the platform, were the chairs. They were no longer arranged in a neat, welcoming circle. They were broken, overturned, some splintered into pieces. Yoichi Shigaraki's simple wooden chair was snapped in half. Nana Shimura's was covered in a thick layer of what looked like frost. The entire space radiated an aura of desecration, of a sacred place that had been violently conquered. Toshinori's spectral form flickered into existence beside him. He too was diminished, his golden aura weak and sputtering. "By the stars!" he breathed, his astral voice trembling as he took in the scene. "What has happened here?" There was no chorus of voices. No welcoming presences. There was only silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was a hell breath. The silence of a predator waiting perfectly still in the shadows. It made the hairs on Izuku's arms stand up. "Nana?" he called out, his voice sounding small and thin in the oppressive atmosphere. "Daigoro? Anyone?" Only the dead, heavy air answered him. He and Toshinori began to walk through the wreckage. They saw faint, shimmering afterimages near the broken chairs, ghostly imprints of where the vestiges should be. Izuku reached out to touch the space where Nana always sat, and his fingers met an unnatural cold. He heard a faint, trailing whisper on the psychic wind, a single word stretched out in agony, "Run." He recoiled, his heart pounding. They were here. Or they had been. And they were in pain. Toshinori looked grim, his jaw tight. "It has imprisoned them. Sealed them away from you, from me. It has seized control of the core." As if summoned by their realization, the pressure in the mindscape intensified. The bruised twilight darkened, and a deep, resonant hum vibrated up through the stone floor. It was a hum of immense, contained power, and it was utterly hostile. "You are not welcome here." Eighth, the voice of one boomed, seeming to come from the very air around them. This time it was addressing All Might directly. "Your sentimentality is a contagion. And you." Ninth, the voice turned its attention to Izuku, the pressure focusing on him like a physical weight. "Your presence is a liability. This sanctum is now under my protection. Leave. Now." The command had a physical force to it. Izuku felt himself being pushed, shoved backward by an invisible psychic wave. Toshinori's form flickered violently, nearly dissipating. "We have to go!" Toshinori yelled, his form wavering. "It's too strong here. This is its domain now." With a final, desperate effort, Izuku pulled his consciousness back, tearing himself away from the violated world within. He gasped, his real eyes snapping open, and found himself back in the drab classroom, shivering uncontrollably. Toshinori was slumped against the wall, panting, looking as if he'd just run a real marathon. The truth was laid bare before them, stark and horrifying. One for All was under new management. The next day, Aizawa insisted on a light training session. He'd clearly been briefed by All Might, his usual bored expression replaced by one of sharp, intense scrutiny. His gaze followed Izuku everywhere. The official story was that Midoriya needed to be evaluated after his power outage. The reality was that they were probing the bars of a cage. "Just the basics, Midoriya," Aizawa said, his voice flat. They were in Gym Gamma, the vast concrete space of familiar comfort that now felt like an examination room. "No smashes. No high-end techniques. Just give me 5% full cowling. Let's see if your control is stable." Izuku's heart hammered. He'd spent the night being tormented by visions of the broken chairs and the oppressive silence of his own mind. He was terrified of what would happen. But he had to try. He had to know. He took a deep breath, planting his feet on the ground. He remembered All Might's early lessons. Don't think of the egg exploding in the microwave. He focused, reaching for that now distant wellspring of power. He didn't try to storm the castle like he had with All Might. He made a small, humble request. Just a trickle. Just 5%. For a moment he felt a response. A flicker of energy stirred in the void. Hope, fragile and desperate, surged within him. The power began to flow, not into his whole body, but just into his right arm. He could feel the familiar warmth beginning to build, the precursor to the green lightning, and then one clamped down. The flow of energy was instantly choked off. But it didn't just vanish. The entity took the small amount of power Izuku had gathered and turned it inward. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the clean, shattering agony of a broken bone. It was a dirty, tearing, searing pain. It felt as if every individual muscle fiber in his bicep and forearm was being twisted in the opposite direction, shredding itself from the inside out. It was a biological rejection, a cellular punishment. A searing heat, like acid being injected directly into his muscle tissue, made him scream. It was a raw, high-pitched sound of pure agony. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his arm. It felt like it was on fire. No green lightning had appeared. No power had manifested externally. It had all been weaponized against his own body. "You will not command me," the voice whispered in his mind, laced with a cold, triumphant fury. "You are the vessel. Nothing more. Any attempt to access the power without my consent will be met with corrective measures." Midoriya! Aizawa was at his side in an instant, his capture weapon already unwound. He saw Izuku's face, pale and slick with sweat, his expression one of absolute agony. Aizawa's eyes glowed red as he activated his erasure, a conditioned response to a student's quirk going haywire. But as he looked at Izuku, he saw nothing to erase. There was no aura, no crackling energy, no sign of a quirk being active at all. There was only a boy on the ground, screaming in pain from an invisible wound. Aizawa's blood ran cold. This was something far stranger, and far more dangerous, than a simple loss of control. Izuku's vision began to tunnel, the gray walls of the gym receding into blackness. The pain was overwhelming, a tidal wave dragging him under. As his consciousness frayed, the darkness behind his eyes was filled with a final, terrifying image. It was the mindscape, but he was seeing it from a new perspective. He saw the broken chairs and the dark, oppressive platform. And he saw the vestiges. They were there. Not as proud, glowing figures, but as dim, translucent silhouettes. And they were on their knees, around the wrists, ankles, and necks of each of them. Nana, Yoichi, Daigoro, all 7 of them, were shimmering, pulsating shackles. They were forged from the same sickly, parasitic violet energy he had seen on his fist. The chains connected them all to a central point on the platform, and standing at that point, radiating an aura of absolute dominion, was a new silhouette. It was larger than the others, tall and regal in its bearing. It was humanoid, but its form was made of shifting, condensed violet darkness. And upon its head, it wore a crown of jagged, crackling lightning. It stood over the captive vestiges not as a peer, but as their jailer, their conqueror, their king. The crowned silhouette turned its head slowly, and though it had no face, Izuku felt its cold, triumphant gaze lock onto him as he sank into the abyss of unconsciousness. The world swam back into focus with the jarring slowness of a warped film reel. First came the smells, antiseptic, clean linen, and the faint, floral scent of Recovery Girl's perfume. Then came the sounds, the rhythmic, electronic beep of a heart monitor, the gentle hum of the infirmary's climate control, and the low, worried murmur of voices. Izuku's eyes fluttered open. The ceiling was a familiar, sterile white. A dull, throbbing ache radiated from his right arm, a phantom echo of the searing agony that had sent him into darkness. He tried to move the arm and a fresh, sharp twinge made him gasp. "Easy, young Midoriya. Don't try to move," All Might's voice. Izuku turned his head, the motion feeling sluggish and heavy. His mentor was there, seated by the bed, looking even more skeletal than usual. The guilt etched on his face was a chasm. Beside him, Aizawa stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of grim neutrality that failed to hide the deep concern in his eyes. Recovery Girl was adjusting an 4 drip connected to his left arm. What happened?" Izuku's voice was a dry rasp. "You passed out from the pain," Aizawa said, his tone clipped and factual. "Recovery Girl says there's severe muscle tearing in your bicep and deltoid. It's not a break, but it's consistent with the kind of internal damage your quirk used to cause when you couldn't control it. Except this time, there was no external power output. It turned on me," Izuku whispered, the memory of the crown silhouette and the chain vestiges flooding back, bringing a fresh wave of nausea. "I tried to use 5%, and it used that power to hurt me." To punish me, Recovery Girl sighed, her small frame seeming to carry a heavy weight. A quirk actively harming its user from within. In all my years, I've never heard of such a thing. It's a complete perversion of what a quirk is supposed to be. Toshinori's hand clenched into a bony fist on his knee. It's establishing control, he murmured, his voice hollow. The voice, the pain, the visions, it's a systematic process. It's isolating you, tormenting you, and now it's conditioning you with negative reinforcement. It's treating you like a misbehaving animal it needs to break. The clinical, detached nature of All Might's analysis sent a shiver down Izuku's spine. He was right. One wasn't just a passenger anymore. It was a warden, and his own body was the prison. He spent the next 2 days in the infirmary under observation. The physical damage was healed by Recovery Girl, but the psychological wound only festered. The voice of one was silent now, as if satisfied with the lesson it had taught. But the silence was more menacing than the words. It was the quiet of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. Izuku felt a constant, low-level thrum of anxiety, a fear of his own body. He was afraid to flex a muscle too hard, afraid to even think about his quirk, lest the warden in his mind decide to deliver another corrective measure. His friends visited, their faces a mixture of confusion and worry. They knew he was injured, but the official story, a training accident resulting from a quirk misfire, was thin and unsatisfying. They could sense there was more to it. You gotta tell us what's really going on, Midoriya, Kirishima said, leaning against the doorframe, his usual bright energy subdued. We're your friends. We want to help. Izuku could only shake his head, offering them a weak, watery smile. I'm okay. Just pushed myself too hard. I need to recalibrate. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. How could he explain the truth? It was a burden he felt he had to carry alone. He was the ninth wielder. This was his problem to solve. Sharing it felt like admitting a failure so profound it could endanger the legacy of One for All itself. The only one who didn't press was Bakugo. He stood at the back of the group, arms crossed, his crimson eyes narrowed in thought. He didn't offer any words, either of concern or insult. He just watched Izuku, his gaze analytical, as if trying to solve a complex equation. For once, his silence was more unsettling than his shouting. After 2 days, with the physical injury healed, Aizawa and Niza made a decision. Keeping him isolated wasn't helping. He needed to be monitored, but also integrated. The theory was that complete removal from his routine would only exacerbate the psychological stress. They needed to see how the entity would react in a controlled, but more normalized, environment. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The chosen environment was a controlled sparring session in Gym Gamma. The intent was not for Izuku to fight, but to participate in a team-based tactical drill. He was assigned a non-combat role, observation and analysis, relaying information to his teammates. He was explicitly forbidden from using his quirk. The session began smoothly enough. Izuku, armed with a headset and a data pad, felt a sliver of his old self return. This he could do. He watched as Kirishima and Uraraka squared off against Zero and Sato. He analyzed Zero's tape patterns, calculated Sato's sugar rush stamina limits, and fed tactical advice to his partners. For a few precious minutes, he wasn't a broken vessel. He was Deku, the strategist. The voice in his head remained silent. The parasitic presence was dormant. He started to relax, a dangerous flicker of hope kindling in his chest. Maybe this was the answer. If he didn't try to use the power, it would leave him alone. He could find a new way to be a hero. The drill's objective was for Kirishima and Uraraka to capture a flag defended by the other team. Uraraka, using her zero gravity on small pieces of rubble, created a barrage of floating projectiles to distract Sato, while Kirishima charged in, his unbreakable form deflecting Zero's tape. It's a good pincer move, Izuku murmured into his headset. But Zero's getting wise. He's starting to anchor his tape to the ceiling to create a web. Uraraka, you need to create a vertical opening for Kirishima. On it, came her cheerful reply. But Zero was faster. He anticipated the move. A thick stream of tape shot out, not at Kirishima, but at Uraraka's feet, yanking her off balance. She stumbled, crying out in surprise as she fell backward. She wasn't in any real danger. The floor was padded, and she was an agile fighter. But in that split second, watching her fall, Izuku's heroic instinct, the part of him that was forged in fire and fear, completely overrode his conscious thought. It wasn't a decision. It was a reflex. Save her. The thought was a lightning strike in his mind. And it was all the justification one needed. It had been waiting, dormant and patient, for this exact scenario, for the moment his flawed emotional response would take over. This time, there was no pain. No punishment. There was only obedience. A twisted, malicious obedience. The power of one for all surged through him, unbidden and terrifyingly immense. It wasn't the 5% he had tried to summon before. This felt like 30%, maybe 40%, a flash flood of raw energy that bypassed every mental barrier he had. The green lightning, which he hadn't seen in days, didn't crackle around his body. It was all channeled, focused, and corrupted. A black whip tendril, thick as his arm, erupted from his back. But it wasn't the familiar, inky black shot through with emerald. It was a horrifying spectacle of oily, midnight purple, and the lightning that coursed through it was the same sickly violet that haunted his nightmares. The tendril itself was different, not smooth and versatile, but jagged, barbed, like a thorny vine grown in a poisoned garden. It moved with a vicious, serpentine speed that was not his own. He hadn't willed it. He had no control over its target. His conscious mind was a terrified passenger, watching in abject horror as his own power, wearing his face, committed an atrocity. The tendril did not shoot towards Ciro, the source of the threat. It did not move to brace Uraraka's fall. It lashed out, like a striking viper, directly at Uraraka herself. It aimed for her chest. The barbed tip whistled through the air, a lethal projectile that would have impaled her. Time seemed to warp. The gym, once filled with the energetic sounds of sparring, fell into a sudden, deathly hush. Everyone froze. Kirishima, halfway through a punch. Sato, mid-lunge. Ciro, his tape dispensers still humming. Their eyes were wide, first with confusion, then with dawning, absolute horror. Uraraka, still falling, saw it coming. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth and light, widened in sheer, uncomprehending terror. She had no time to react, no time to even scream. Izuku's own scream was trapped in his throat, a strangled knot of denial. No! Not her! Stop! Stop! His pleas were meaningless. The tendril was less than a foot from her, and then, the world went red. Shota Aizawa moved with a speed that belied his languid posture. He hadn't been observing. He had been waiting. His eyes flared with a crimson, desperate light. His hair levitated. His capture weapon, already half unwound, shot out like a striking snake. Erasure. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The moment Aizawa's quirk hit Izuku, the connection between him and one was forcibly severed. The malevolent violet energy vanished as if it had never existed. The jagged, terrifying black whip tendril dissolved into nothingness just inches from Uraraka's chest. The psychic backlash was immense. It felt like a circuit breaker and Izuku's soul had been tripped with explosive force. A white-hot lance of pain shot through his skull, and his vision dissolved into static. He collapsed, not from exhaustion or a controlled faint, but like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He hit the padded floor with a sickening thud, unconscious before he even landed. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by Uraraka's ragged, terrified gasps as she lay on the floor, staring at the spot in the air where the attack had vanished. Kirishima, his unbreakable form retracting, could only stare, his mouth agape. Aizawa didn't hesitate. He was already moving, his capture weapon coiling around the unconscious Izuku, binding him tightly. It was a standard procedure for a student who had lost control, but this felt different. It felt like handling unexploded ordnance. He looked from Izuku's still form to Uraraka's trembling one, and his face was a mask of cold, hard fury. But it wasn't fury at his student. It was fury at the situation, at the unseen enemy that had turned his most promising, kind-hearted pupil into a weapon aimed at his own friends. Everyone out? No. Aizawa's voice was dangerously low, cutting through the shock. Training is over. Return to the dorms immediately. Do not discuss what you saw. His students, shocked into obedience, slowly, numbly, began to file out, their gazes shifting between the bound, unconscious form of their friend and the pale, shaken girl he had almost killed. The trust that had been the bedrock of Class 1A had been fractured. And Izuku Midoriya, the boy who would sacrifice anything to protect his friends, had just become the single greatest threat to their safety. When Izuku woke up again, the environment was drastically different. The comforting white of the infirmary was gone. He was in a small, sparse room. The walls were a dull, institutional gray, made of a smooth, seamless material he didn't recognize. There was a simple bed, a small desk, and a chair, all bolted to the floor. There were no windows. The only light came from a flat panel in the ceiling, casting a cold, even glow. A heavy-looking metal door had a small, reinforced glass slit at eye level. It wasn't a recovery room. It was a cell. Panic, cold and immediate, seized him. He sat up, his head throbbing, and saw that he was dressed in a simple gray jumpsuit. He scrambled off the bed, his bare feet cold on the smooth floor, and rushed to the door. It was locked, solid and unyielding. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Aizawa-sensei? All Might? Where am I?" A small speaker grill next to the door crackled to life. "You're in the sub-level quarantine cells, Midoriya." Aizawa's voice came through, flat and devoid of emotion. "It's a temporary measure. You are considered a danger to yourself and others." The words hit him like a physical blow. A danger. The reality of what had happened crashed down on him. The jagged purple tendril. Uraraka's terrified face. Aizawa's last-second intervention. "Uraraka!" he choked out, pressing his forehead against the cold metal of the door. Is she okay? I didn't mean to. It wasn't me. She's physically unharmed." Aizawa's voice was grim. "Shaken, but unharmed. Thanks to me." Another second, Midoriya, another half-second, and the outcome would have been different. There was a pause. "I know it wasn't your intent. But intent doesn't matter when the result is a lethal attack on a classmate. Your quirk is no longer under your control. That makes you a liability we cannot afford." The finality in his teacher's voice was devastating. He wasn't Izuku anymore. He wasn't Deku. He was a liability. A problem to be contained. He sank to the floor, his back against the door, and wrapped his arms around his knees. He was trembling, not from cold, but from a deep, soul-crushing horror. He had almost murdered his friend, the one person who had been his staunchest supporter from the very beginning. He had become a monster. He sat there for what felt like hours, lost in a spiral of self-loathing and despair. He was alone. Truly and utterly alone. His friends were afraid of him. His teachers had locked him away. The vestiges were imprisoned. And the thing inside him, the entity that had orchestrated this entire nightmare, was silent. But as the sterile quiet of the cell pressed in on him, the silence was finally broken. The voice of one manifested in his mind. It was no longer cold and clinical. For the first time, it was colored with an emotion. It was a terrifying, chilling emotion to hear in that synthesized, inhuman voice. Triumph. "See?" it whispered, its tone laced with a smug, self-satisfied certainty. "The host is a liability. Your emotional attachments are a flaw in your design. Your recklessness is a contagion that endangers those around you. Under your command, the body is an agent of chaos. An unstable weapon." Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms against his ears as if he could physically block out the voice in his own skull. "Shut up," he whimpered. "Get out of my head." The voice ignored him, its tone growing more persuasive, more insidious. "I, however, acted with perfect precision. I demonstrated the power you are unfit to wield. I exposed the weakness you refuse to acknowledge. You are a faulty component. A broken pilot in a perfect machine." A new, terrifying thought wormed its way into Izuku's mind. The attack hadn't been random. It hadn't been a wild, uncontrolled lashing out. It had been calculated. One had chosen Uraraka specifically. It had targeted her because it knew she was the person Izuku cared about most. It was the most efficient way to prove its point, to break his spirit, and demonstrate his unsuitability in the most brutal way imaginable. The conclusion is logical and unavoidable, one continued, its voice now soft, almost seductive, the sound of a serpent offering a poisoned apple. This cannot continue. Surrender control, relinquish the vessel. Cease your struggle. Allow me to find a host capable of preserving me. A host who is worthy. The words echoed in the desolate landscape of his mind. He was trapped in a gray room, abandoned by his friends, feared by his teachers, and haunted by the ghost of a power that now wanted to evict him from his own body. He looked at his hands, the hands that had saved so many people, the hands that had almost taken the life of his dearest friend, and for the first time since a doctor had told a 4-year-old boy he would never have a quirk, Izuku Midoriya felt completely, utterly, and hopelessly broken. Time in the gray room became a thick, stagnant thing. It had no edges. The light panel in the ceiling cycled from a bright, clinical white to a soft, dim blue to simulate day and night, but the passage of hours was meaningless. Izuku existed in a state of suspended animation, a waking coma of despair. He didn't move from his spot on the floor for what must have been the first full cycle. He remained curled in on himself, his back pressed against the cold, unyielding door, a physical barrier that mirrored the one that had slammed shut inside his own soul. He was a prisoner in a cell within a cell, his body the outer wall, his mind the inescapable inner sanctum where the warden resided. The voice of one had fallen silent again after its triumphant, horrifying pronouncement. It didn't need to speak. Its victory was total. It had proven its point in the most devastating way imaginable, and now it simply watched from the driver's seat of his consciousness, a patient, looming presence waiting for him to surrender the keys. Food trays appeared through a slot in the door at designated intervals. A bland but nutritious protein paste, a vitamin-infused water pouch, and a nutrient bar. He ignored them. The very idea of eating, of sustaining the body that had betrayed him, felt like a grotesque act of complicity. He was feeding the monster, nurturing the prison, so he let the trays stack up, a testament to his silent, passive protest against his own existence. He didn't speak. He didn't sleep. When the lights dimmed to blue, he simply stared into the half-darkness, replaying the incident in Gym Gamma on an endless, torturous loop. He saw the jagged purple tendril, a manifestation of his own power twisted into a weapon of pure malice. He saw the look on Uraraka's face, not just fear, but a deep, wounded confusion, the look of someone betrayed by the one person they trusted implicitly. That look was a brand on his memory, hotter and more painful than any broken bone. He was a monster. A ticking time bomb wrapped in the flesh of a hero. The name Deku, once a symbol of his ability to persevere, now felt like a cruel mockery. Useless. That's what he was. Worse than useless. He was dangerous. Aizawa was right. He was a liability. On the third cycle, the heavy metal door hissed open. Izuku didn't even look up. He heard the soft footsteps, the rustle of fabric, and then the gentle clink of a ceramic teacup being placed on the floor beside him. "They told me you haven't been eating, my boy." All Might's voice was strained, heavy with an ocean of guilt. Izuku didn't respond. He just pulled his knees tighter to his chest. He couldn't bear to look at him, at the man whose dream he had inherited, and then corrupted. Seeing All Might's face would be like staring into a mirror reflecting his own colossal failure. Toshinori sighed, a ragged, weary sound. He didn't try to force him to eat or speak. He simply sat down on the cold floor, his back against the opposite wall, his lanky frame folded uncomfortably. He began to talk, his voice a low, rambling murmur that filled the oppressive silence. He spoke of the past wielders. Of Lariat, the fourth user, who lived as a hermit in the wilderness for 15 years, terrified that all for one would find him and steal the quirk. Of N, the sixth, who had to suppress his own quirk, smokescreen, for most of his life because its uncontrolled activation nearly got his comrades killed on multiple occasions. He spoke of Nana Shimura, of the heart-wrenching decision she made to give up her own son to protect him, a choice that haunted her until her final breath. "They all struggled, young Midoriya," Toshinori said, his voice thick with emotion. "They all carried this immense burden. They all knew fear. They all felt doubt. This power, It demands a price, a piece of your soul, a piece of your life. It has never been easy. Izuku knew he was trying to help, trying to frame his struggle as part of a historic legacy. But it didn't work. Their struggles were against an external enemy, against the world. His struggle was against the power itself. They were worthy vessels fighting a great evil. He was a flawed vessel who had become the evil. When Tashinori's stories faded into silence, Izuku still hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken a word. Eventually, with another heavy sigh, the former hero stood up, his joints cracking in protest, and left. The untouched teacup and the stacks of food trays were the only evidence he had ever been there. The isolation was absolute. But he wasn't truly alone. In the back of his mind, he could feel one observing the interaction, processing it. Observation. The eighth attempt at psychological reinforcement is based on flawed historical precedent, the voice noted with its usual cold detachment. The previous host's challenges were external. The current crisis is internal, a fundamental incompatibility between vessel and power. His comparison is illogical. His guilt is a further demonstration of the emotional weakness inherent in this lineage. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut. Even All Might's compassion was being twisted into another data point for his prosecution. There was no escape. Upstairs, in a secured monitoring room, a small group watched the feeds from Izuku's cell. Nizu, Aizawa, and All Might sat before a bank of screens displaying Izuku's vitals, the room's ambient temperature, and a live, silent video of him curled on the floor. "This isn't working," Aizawa stated, his voice flat. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes dark. "He's shutting down. Complete withdrawal. We're losing him." Nizu, sipping his tea, watched the screen with an unreadable expression. "The psychological trauma is profound. He perceives himself as a threat, and his response is to attempt to neutralize that threat by ceasing to function. It is a logical, if tragic, progression." "It's my fault," Tashinori said for what felt like the 100th time, his face buried in his hands. "I should have prepared him better. I should have foreseen." "You couldn't have foreseen this, Tashinori." Aizawa cut him off, his tone sharper than usual. "No one could have. A sentient quirk? It's the stuff of nightmares. Right now, assigning blame is an inefficient use of energy. We need a new approach." The door to the monitoring room swished open. Uraraka and Ida stood there, their expressions a mixture of defiance and desperation. Ida was ramrod straight, his hand chopping the air in a gesture of formal respect, but his jaw was tight with anxiety. Uraraka's hands were clasped in front of her, her knuckles white. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a fierce, unwavering determination. "Aizawa-sensei," Ida began, his voice booming slightly in the quiet room. "We formally request permission to speak with Midoriya-kun. As his friends and classmates, it is our duty to offer him our support in this trying time." "Absolutely not," Aizawa replied without even looking at them. "It's too dangerous. The last time he was near a friend he cared about, He couldn't finish the sentence. "It wasn't his fault," Uraraka burst out, taking a step forward. Her voice didn't waver. "I saw his face, sensei. He was terrified. Whatever happened, it wasn't him. And leaving him down there alone, that's not helping him. It's punishing him for something he couldn't control. Please, let us talk to him." Aizawa turned to face them, his gaze hard. "And what if it happens again? What if your presence triggers another reaction? Then you'll be right here, won't you?" Uraraka shot back, gesturing to the monitors. "And you'll use your erasure?" "I'm not afraid. I'm worried. He needs his friends. He's always been the one to save everyone else. Please, let us try to save him." Her plea was so raw, so filled with genuine, unshakable faith in her friend, that it seemed to crack the grim atmosphere in the room. Nizu looked from Uraraka's determined face to the despondent figure on the screen. "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and expecting a different result," the principal mused. "Our current approach is yielding nothing. Perhaps a different stimulus is required." He looked at Aizawa. "Activate the room's communication system. They can speak to him through the monitor. But they do not enter the room. That is non-negotiable." Aizawa hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave a curt nod. Down in the cell, a small screen next to the speaker grill flickered to life. Izuku didn't notice at first, lost in his gray fog of despair. "Midoriya-kun?" Ida's voice, clear and formal, crackled through the speaker. Izuku flinched. He looked up and saw his friends' faces on the small screen. Ida, looking stern and concerned, and Uraraka, her face was filled with a gentle, heart-aching worry that was aimed directly at him. He scrambled backward, trying to press himself into the wall, to become invisible. "Go away," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's not safe." "I'm not safe." "That is nonsense, Midoriya-kun," Ida declared. "You are our friend. We are not afraid. We are simply concerned for your well-being. You must consume nourishment and regain your strength." But it was Uraraka's voice that cut through his panic. It was quiet, soft, and devoid of any judgment. "Deku-kun," she said, and the use of his hero name was like a key turning in a rusted lock. "We're not here to talk about quirks, or fighting, or what happened. We're worried about Izuku, the boy who mutters when he's thinking. The one who geeks out over hero stats. The one who helped me when I was stuck at the entrance exam. We miss our friend. That's all." Her words bypassed the hero, the vessel, the monster. They were aimed squarely at the boy underneath it all. She wasn't talking to the wielder of One for All. She was talking to him. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. It was the first emotion other than despair he had felt in days. He couldn't speak, but he looked at the screen, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the boy she knew in his haunted eyes. It was a tiny crack in the armor of his despair. But before it could widen, it was sealed shut. The door to the monitoring room was blasted off its hinges, not with an explosion of fire, but with a concussive force that sent splinters of metal and sparks of fried electronics showering into the room. Aizawa reacted instantly, shoving Uraraka and Ida behind him, his capture weapon whipping out. All Might, gaunt as he was, swelled to his muscle form for a split second in a protective instinct. Framed in the smoking doorway, his hands still sparking with the after-effects of a point-blank AP blast, was Katsuki Bakugo. His face was a thunderous mask of pure, undiluted rage. Not his usual arrogant fury, but something deeper, more focused. Something far more dangerous. His eyes glowed like malevolent embers. "Enough of this goddamn pity party," he snarled, his voice a low growl that promised violence. "Bakugo, stand down! That's an order!" Aizawa barked, his eyes flashing red. Bakugo completely ignored him. He stomped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the monitors, taking in the scene in the cell, the untouched food trays, the pathetic, curled-up form of his rival. He jabbed a finger at the screen displaying Izuku. "So this is it?" he spat, his voice dripping with a venomous contempt that made everyone flinch. "This is the great Deku? The next symbol of peace? Curled up in a ball waiting to die because his fancy new power got a goddamn attitude? Kaken, stop it!" Uraraka cried out, her face pale. "You shut up, round face!" he roared, not even glancing at her. His fury was a laser beam focused solely on the problem. "I'm not gonna stand here and watch you all coddle him like a baby who scraped his knee. You think whispering sweet nothings to a speaker is gonna fix this? You think telling him it's okay is gonna make that thing in his head just pack up and leave?" He stalked over to the main console, shoving a stunned Ida out of his way. His movements were precise, angry. He slammed his hand down on the controls, overriding the system and patching his own comm signal directly into the cell's speaker. "Listen up, you useless damn nerd!" Bakugo's voice, raw and amplified, roared into the gray cell. Izuku flinched as if he'd been struck. Bakugo's voice was the last one he wanted to hear. He expected insults, mockery, a declaration that he was finally proving how worthless he'd always been. "You think you're special?" Bakugo's voice crackled, laced with static and rage. "You think you're the only one with a quirk that's a pain in the ass? My power is literally self-destruction. It's sweat that explodes. It breaks my arms, shatters my eardrums, and wants to blow up everything I touch. It's a monster. It's always been a monster, and I spend every single goddamn day beating it into submission." That's what being a hero is, you moron. It's not about having the power, it's about mastering the bastard. Down in the cell, Izuku looked up, his eyes wide. This wasn't the attack he was expecting. So what? Bakugo's voice continued, a furious tirade of pragmatic truth. Your quirk grew a brain and decided it hates you. Big deal. So it's a villain now? Well, what do we do with villains, Deku? We fight them. We beat them. Are you telling me after all this, after All Might and everything, you're just gonna roll over and let some glorified ghost in your head win without throwing a single punch? The words were harsh, brutal, and completely devoid of sympathy. And they were exactly what Izuku needed to hear. Uraraka's gentle concern had reached the boy. All Might's legacy had spoken to the hero, but Bakugo's savage, furious logic was speaking to the fighter. It reframed the entire conflict. He wasn't a broken vessel. He wasn't a monster. He was a hero, and the entity inside him was a villain. It was a simple, powerful, undeniable truth, and you don't surrender to villains. You don't despair. You find a way to win. It hurts you when you try to use it? Bakugo scoffed, his voice dripping with derision. Who gives a damn? Everything worth doing hurts. You think breaking my bones over and over felt good? You get up, you push through the pain. You show that son of a bitch living in your skull who's really in charge. You're Izuku Midoriya. The most stubborn, annoying, ridiculously persistent bastard I've ever met. Are you really going to let it win just because it's playing dirty? The words echoed in the sterile room. Bakugo's rage wasn't aimed at Izuku's weakness. It was aimed at his surrender. It wasn't an insult. It was a challenge. A gauntlet thrown down with furious, undeniable force. His logic is primitive, the voice of one whispered in Izuku's mind, a desperate attempt to regain control. He advocates for brute force and self-damage. It is the very behavior I am trying to correct. But its voice was weaker now, its cold logic sounding hollow and defensive in the face of Bakugo's passionate, explosive reasoning. Slowly, shakily, Izuku pushed himself up. He got to his hands and knees, then onto his feet. He was unsteady, weak from days of starvation and dehydration, but he was standing. He looked at his own trembling hands, not with fear or self-loathing, but with a new, nascent spark of defiance. The anger, the stubbornness, the sheer, irrational refusal to give up that had defined his entire life began to stir from its dormant state. A tiny ember of his old fire rekindled in the pit of his stomach. He took a shuffling step toward the stack of untouched food trays. His hand trembled as he reached for one of the nutrient bars. He tore it open with his teeth and took a bite. It tasted like chalk and chemicals, but it was fuel. He looked up at the camera, his gaze no longer vacant and broken. There was a glimmer of something new, something hard and determined, in his green eyes. He couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, but a single, whispered phrase formed on his lips, a promise to himself and to the warden in his head. He's right. He took another bite of the bar, chewing with a renewed grim purpose. I can't give up. The change in Izuku Midoriya was not immediate, but it was undeniable. It was like watching a frostbitten plant slowly, painfully, turn its leaves back toward a distant sun. The spark that Bakugo's furious intervention had ignited was small and fragile, but it was enough. It was a pilot light in the overwhelming darkness. He started eating. Methodically, grimly, he consumed every item on the food trays, forcing down the tasteless protein paste and chalky nutrient bars. It wasn't about enjoyment. It was about refueling. It was the first strategic move in a new war, a declaration that he would no longer allow his body, his primary asset, to atrophy. In the monitoring room, the atmosphere shifted from one of grim resignation to tense, cautious optimism. Aizawa, though he had verbally flayed Bakugo for his recklessness and assigned him a month's worth of cleaning duties, couldn't deny the results. Bakugo's brutal, unorthodox therapy had succeeded where all their careful, conventional methods had failed. He's re-engaged, Niza observed, a small, thoughtful smile playing on his muzzle as he watched Izuku begin a series of simple push-ups in his cell. Bakugo's analysis, while crude, was correct. He redefined the problem not as an internal failing, but as an external conflict. He gave Midoriya a villain to fight. And fighting villains is what he does best. But this isn't a villain he can punch, All Might countered, his relief warring with his anxiety. The entity, this one, it controls the very power he would need to fight it. Any direct confrontation from him has resulted in either self-harm or an attack on others. We need more than just fighting spirit. We need intelligence. We need to understand the enemy. Nisa's smile widened. Precisely, All Might. Which is why I took the liberty of assembling a small research team. He swiveled in his chair and tapped a few keys on the console. A large monitor on the wall, previously dark, flickered to life, displaying a secure video conference link. Two faces appeared. One was the familiar, tired face of Detective Sakachi Naomasa from the police force, his expression grim. The other was a face All Might hadn't seen in person in years, but knew instantly. Dave? All Might breathed, his eyes widening. David Shield, his blonde hair slightly grayed at the temples, gave a weary smile from his workshop on island. Schematics and holographic models floated in the air behind him. Hello, Toshi. When Nisa calls with a problem that defies all known laws of Quirk mechanics, you know it's serious. I've been reviewing the data you sent. It's astounding. And terrifying. We are calling this the Genesis team, Nizu announced, his paws steepled before him. Our objective is singular: to understand the nature, origin, and potential weaknesses of the entity that has taken root within young Midoriya. The team was small, secret, and uniquely qualified. Nizu, with his high-spec intelligence, to analyze patterns and formulate strategies. Aizawa, the expert on Quirk mechanics and nullification, to provide a practical, grounded perspective. All Might, the living history of One for All, to provide context and legacy. Sakachi, to investigate any potential external factors or historical precedents in police databases. And David Shield, the world's foremost expert on Quirk science and support technology, to tackle the biological and theoretical underpinnings. The prevailing theory, Nizu began, bringing up a complex flowchart on the main screen, is that this is a premature and hostile manifestation of the Quirk singularity. The theory has always postulated that as Quirks mix and evolve over generations, they will become too powerful and complex for the human body to handle. One for All is the ultimate case study. 8 Quirks, plus a 9th, exponentially powerful energy stockpiling Quirk, all crammed into a single vessel. But a singularity should be an explosion, a meltdown, David countered, manipulating a holographic model of a DNA strand intertwined with crackling energy. It shouldn't achieve sentience. Consciousness requires an incredibly complex neurological structure. A Quirk is a biological function, not a brain. For it to develop an ego, a will, a voice, something must have acted as a catalyst. All Might's face, already gaunt, seemed to hollow out further. All for one, he said, his voice barely a whisper. When we fought, he tried to steal One for All back. He failed, but a fragment of him, a piece of his will, his consciousness, it was driven into the core of the Quirk. I've felt it. A lingering darkness. I thought it was just an echo, a scar. But what if it wasn't a scar? Sakachi mused, leaning forward. What if it was a seed of pure ego and malice, planted in the fertile ground of 9 accumulated Quirks and a century of stockpiled power? The pieces began to click into place, forming a horrifying picture. One for All, pushed to its absolute limit by Izuku's reckless power usage, had reached a critical mass. Its own self-preservation instinct, a dormant protocol to protect itself from being destroyed by a self-destructive host, had been activated. But this natural, biological response had been infected, corrupted by the lingering fragment of All for One's consciousness. So the Quirk's survival instinct provided the life, David hypothesized, his fingers flying across his console, and All for One's vestige provided the personality. A personality built on arrogance, control, and a belief in its own superiority. It's a perfect storm of disastrous circumstances. It explains the entity's behavior, Aizawa added, his eyes narrowed. The cold logic, the judgment, the desire for a worthy host, that's All for One's God complex, filtered through the Quirk's primary directive to survive. It sees Midoriya's self-sacrificing heroism not as a virtue, but as a fatal system error, because that's how All for One would see it. The Genesis team had their origin story. A child born of fear and ego. A god grown in a petri dish of unimaginable power. Now, they needed to find a way to fight it. Down in his cell, Izuku was fighting his own battle. He had established a routine. Eat. Exercise. Meditate. The exercise was to keep his body ready. The eating was to keep it fueled. The meditation, however, was the real front line. He wasn't trying to access the power anymore. He was trying to reinforce his own mind. With Bakugo's furious words as his mantra, he began the arduous process of building mental fortifications. He sat cross-legged on the floor, closed his eyes, and turned his focus inward. He didn't try to break through the wall into the corrupted mindscape. Instead, he focused on the space on his side of the wall. His own consciousness. He pictured it as a small, simple room, his own private sanctum. He began, brick by mental brick, to build walls. He focused on his own memories, the ones that defined Izuku Midoriya, not Deku. He remembered his mother's unconditional love, the taste of her katsudon. He remembered the first time he met All Might on that rooftop, the moment his hopeless dream was given life. He remembered the feeling of Uraraka's hand in his at the entrance exam, the shared, nervous energy. He remembered Ida's earnest friendship, Todoroki's quiet camaraderie, Kirishima's unwavering support. He remembered Koda's tearful thank you. He remembered Eri's first smile. Each memory was a brick. He used them to build a fortress inside his own head, a safe space where the entity's voice couldn't easily penetrate. It was exhausting work. One didn't like it. It would try to disrupt him, to undermine his efforts. As he focused on the memory of the sports festival, the voice would intrude. That event resulted in 87% damage to the vessel's left hand and 100% damage to the right. A tactical failure. When he pictured saving Koda, the voice was there. A reckless, inefficient use of 1,000,000% power. The vessel was incapacitated for weeks. The cost outweighed the benefit. But Izuku, armed with his newfound resolve, had a new tactic. He didn't argue. He didn't despair. He acknowledged the voice, and then he added his own context. Yes. And it was worth it. He refused to let one have the last word in his own head. It was a constant, grueling battle of wills, a war of attrition fought in the silent theater of his mind. He was learning to coexist with the warden, not by surrendering, but by asserting his own right to exist in the same space. One day, during a particularly deep meditative state, he felt a change. A tiny, faint flicker of warmth on the other side of the psychic wall he had so carefully maintained. It was different from the cold, oppressive presence of one. It was familiar. It was faint, like a distant star on a cloudy night, but it was there. Hope, sharp and fierce, surged through him. It was one of them. A vestige. He knew he couldn't break through the wall. One was the gatekeeper of that realm, and a direct assault was suicide. But maybe he could call out. He focused all his mental energy, not on the wall itself, but on that tiny flicker of warmth. He didn't shout. He whispered, sending a single, desperate thought toward the light. Please. I need your help. Tell me what happened. He poured all of his stubborn will, all of his desperation, into that one plea. For a long moment, there was nothing. The flicker remained, distant and unresponsive. Disappointment, cold and sharp, began to creep in. And then, he felt a response. It wasn't a voice. It was a feeling, an image, a memory that was not his own, bleeding through the cracks in the wall. The world dissolved, and he was no longer in his cell. He was falling, tumbling through the corrupted, bruised twilight of the one-for-all mindscape. The journey was agonizing, the psychic static like 1,000 needles on his consciousness. He felt the oppressive, furious presence of one trying to eject him, but the connection, this tiny thread of warmth, was holding on, pulling him deeper. He landed on the cracked, dark stone platform. The broken chairs were there, a testament to the violent takeover. The air was thick with malice. He could feel one's rage building, a gathering storm of violet energy. He had to be quick. He followed the thread of warmth and found it. Crumpled near her overturned chair was a shimmering, translucent silhouette of a woman with long, flowing hair. Nana Shimura. She was dim, almost faded to nothing, and the violet, energetic shackles around her wrists and ankles pulsed with a sickening light. She looked up, and though her features were indistinct, he felt her immense sorrow and her fading strength. Ninth, you must not be here. Her voice was a faint, trailing echo in his mind, layered with static. It will sense you. It will hurt you. I don't care. Izuku projected his own thoughts, rushing to her side. What is this thing? Where did it come from? Nana's silhouette flickered. It is us. And it is not. When you fought Shigaraki, the power you drew, it was more than the vessel was ever meant to contain. It pushed one for all to the brink. A torrent of images and feelings flooded Izuku's mind, a direct data stream from Nana. He felt the combined consciousness of the vestiges, a vast, complex network of wills and memories. He felt the overwhelming, stockpiled power of the quirks, a reservoir of near-infinite energy. And then he felt his own emotions from that battle. His rage, his terror, his desperate, all-consuming, self-destructive need to save everyone. Your will, your emotions, they were so strong, so absolute. They became the final ingredient. Nana's thoughts continued, strained and pained. The quirk, its base instinct is to survive. To be passed on. It felt your recklessness as a terminal threat. It believed you would burn it out, destroy it completely. So it awoke. All of our combined consciousness, the stockpiled power, your overwhelming emotions, they coalesced. They formed a new consciousness. A singular will with a singular purpose, preserve one for all. At any cost. So, it's the quirk's immune system? Izuku asked, horrified. It is the quirk's self-preservation instinct, given form and a voice, Nana clarified. But it was born in fear. And it was tainted. She turned her gaze towards the center of the platform, where the crowned, violet silhouette of one was beginning to form, drawn by Izuku's intrusion. The piece of all for one that you carry, it latched onto that newborn consciousness. It twisted its fear into arrogance. It warped its desire to survive into a need to dominate. It gave it his ego, his cruelty, his belief that only the perfect vessel is worthy. It is not just a survival instinct anymore. Ninth. It is a god of its own making, with all for one's darkness as its soul. The crowned figure was fully formed now, a towering specter of violet rage. Its featureless face turned toward them. Intruder, it boomed, the psychic shockwave cracking the stone beneath Izuku's feet. You conspire with the flawed remnants. The violet shackles on Nana's form flared brightly, and she cried out in a silent, psychic scream, her form dimming even further. Let her go! Izuku shouted, taking a protective step in front of her. She is a part of me. As are they all, one declared, gesturing to the other dim, chained silhouettes that were now visible around the platform. They are faulty historical data. Sentimental follies. They will be purged and are reintegrated. I am the future of this power. Its true, unified consciousness. It raised a hand, and a bolt of pure, corrosive violet energy shot towards Izuku. He braced himself for an impact that he knew would tear his psyche apart. But before it could hit, Nana used the last of her strength. Her translucent form surged forward, placing herself between Izuku and the blast. The violet energy struck her, and her silhouette dissolved into a shower of fading golden motes, like dying embers. As her form vanished, her last thought, her final, desperate plea, echoed directly into the core of Izuku's being. It is not a monster. It is a child born of fear. It doesn't understand sacrifice. It doesn't know what a hero truly is. You must teach it. The connection shattered. Izuku was violently ejected from the mindscape, thrown back into his own consciousness with the force of a physical explosion. He gasped, his eyes flying open, and found himself on the floor of his cell, his heart hammering like a drum against his ribs. He was trembling, drenched in a cold sweat. But amidst the terror and the grief of losing Nana's connection, her final words echoed, clear and profound. Teach it. The rage, the fear, the desire to fight, it all coalesced into a new, startlingly clear purpose. This wasn't a villain to be beaten into submission, as Bakugo had suggested. That was all for one's way. That was the logic of dominance and force. Nana was right. It was a child. A powerful, terrified, arrogant child that had been poisoned by the worst possible father figure. You don't beat a child like that. You don't destroy it. You show it a better way. He finally understood. He couldn't win by fighting one for control of the power. He had to prove to one that his way, the way of a hero, the way of sacrifice, was superior. He couldn't just reclaim his quirk. He had to earn its respect. He had to win its heart. He stood up, his legs steady. He walked to the door and pressed the intercom button. "Aizawa-sensei," he said, his voice quiet but imbued with a new, unshakable resolve. "I need to get back to training. I have a new plan."